or eternal principles. So in this story, a man who grows fowl or chickens approaches a neighbor and offers that he's prepared facilities to double his production next year, and up until that time he's grown his own feed, but would his neighbor grow the additional feed that he needs in exchange for so much of his production? And they agree, and so each of them issues to each other a promissory obligations. The man who grows the feed promises to give so much feed in exchange for so much fowl, and likewise the man who produces fowl promises to give so much fowl in exchange for this other man producing so much feed. Well then, in fact, in our colonial economies here in what became the United States, people were issuing their promissory obligations, which, to make a long story short, I've published a mathematic proof. In fact, it's embedded in the worldwide mandate for mathematically perfected economy and absolute consensual representation that I sent Thor yesterday. But it's a proof that a promissory obligation is actually the only viable instrument for monetizing our wealth. And though the arguments for that are very interesting and important for us to understand, I'd like to move on beyond that because this story is an example of it. And you may intuit the reasons yourselves then from the simple story here. So what happens is each man holds a promissory obligation of the other, and they might go to the doctor or the mercantile store and say, well, I have this promissory obligation against of Mike Montagne to deliver so many chickens. Would you take so many of these chickens that Mike has promised to deliver to me in payment for, these goods, these tools, this service? And they would say yes, and so this person holding my promissory obligation would write a promissory obligation of it, which that person then could collect from me eventually when the fowl or chickens are to be delivered. And the important and very, very important thing to understand about this is that in the natural life cycle of a promissory obligation, the real creditor, the person that accepts the obligation, is paid in full from the very outset. The banking system denies the real creditor any interest whatsoever. And that's a very important thing to understand. The other thing is that when the promissory obligation is fulfilled, that is, when its principal is paid, it is retired from circulation, and rightly retired from circulation, because it no longer represents anything. And this is why I say, and I teach, that the first phenomenal crime of the banking systems which have been imposed upon the world is that they launder the principal into their own possession. In other words, as I have said, the banking system never gives up lawful consideration, which would comprise a debt to itself. It's only printing the evidence of our promissory obligations to each other. And those obligations, in fact, exist as an obligation to pay and retire principal from circulation, as would maintain a circulation which at all times is representative of the property that is related to the promissory obligation. So, for example, in regard to a $100,000 home with a 100-year lifespan, if we figure the depreciation or consumption in a linear manner for the sake of simple understanding, we would pay for the home at $1,000 a year, or $83.33 a month under mathematically perfected economy. But it's this obligatory schedule of payment alone, and which alone can maintain a circulation which at all times equals the remaining value of the property which the circulation represents. There is no other possible way to maintain the integrity of the circulation than an eradication of interest and this obligatory schedule of payment. So in simple terms, that's all that mathematically perfected economy is. It's a resolution of the crimes against us by the banking systems of the world, and it is a resolution therefore by eradication of interest and an obligatory schedule of payment at the rate of consumption or depreciation of the related property, which and which alone maintains a circulation which at all times maintains a 1-to-1-to-1 relationship between remaining circulation, remaining value of represented property, and the remaining obligation. So that's mathematically perfected economy in a nutshell. The next issue of concern for you is being as this is the only solution of what I call the categoric faults of the present lie of pretended economy. And those categoric faults are 1, inflation, deflation, and what I call maldisposition, which is a perpetual increase in the proportion of the circulation which is dedicated to servicing this artificial sum of debt which interest multiplies. The second categoric fault then is systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property. And the final categoric fault, there are only three, is inherent, irreversible, and therefore terminal multiplication of artificial indebtedness by interest. So mathematically perfected economy solves all three of these categoric faults simply by eradication of interest and this obligatory schedule of payment. How? Inflation and deflation are disproportions in circulation per remaining value of represented property, and only an eradication of interest and this obligatory schedule of payment therefore solve inflation and deflation. They also solve maldisposition because the eradication of interest prevents this multiplication of artificial indebtedness in proportion to the circulation or remaining capacity to pay. And of course, in the case of our third fault, which is inherent, irreversible, and therefore terminal multiplication of artificial indebtedness by interest, eradication of interest obviously solves this or eliminates this multiplication of indebtedness in proportion to capacity to pay. And so, in fact, our second categoric fault, which was systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property, is solved by the integral combination of these first and third solutions, because those two solutions solve every power to impose disproportion or cost upon the economy, which are the only tools which this obfuscation of the currency has to manipulate the cost or value of money or property. So at this point we lost our connection the first 4 times during this discussion. There you are. Sorry about that.
Hello. Yeah, we have a bad connection.
Yeah, that happens. So we might have to endure that a few times for all we know. So in regard to this, what I know we've talked about this before, Thor. The thing some of the others at the meeting may not really realize is that my work precedes all these many plagiarists who exist now, who have risen at the 11th hour and are proposing one solution after another, even as from the beginning over 40 years ago my work was a proof of singular monetary solution. Now I've gone over this with Brigida, I've gone over this with Thor Sari, I've gone over this with literally tens if not hundreds of thousands of people over 40 years, and no one has there's been a few tries. I can count on my fingers how many kinds of tries there have been, and few more than two handfuls of fingers, the times yet that anyone has even attempted to challenge my proposition. And an example of these people would be, for instance, G. Edward Griffin, who's author of The Creature of Jekyll Island. Well, he's an Austrian economist, so-called, and they're advocates of interest. Many years ago, he published his attempted proof that interest isn't terminal. And I captioned his proof on an article which I maintained on my web pages since I believe the late 90s, disproving his proof. Well, he was an advocate of interest even through the 2008 presidential campaign here, where he supported Ron Paul, who is likewise a so-called Austrian economist. And many people wrote Griffin challenging him with my article, and guess what? He's come out with a new book, and now he's pretending to have solved this issue of interest, and he can't even articulate it in its actual terms. So of course he dare not do that because it's plagiarism. But nevertheless, he's plagiarized the idea. 2 years ago, it was the opposite of what he was advocating, and now all of a sudden, because I've had an article which is very embarrassing to him online all this time, it's finally caught up with him. And same thing with Bill Stills. Alan Hodgson Brown has claimed that interest isn't the issue, even in personal debates with me at Op-Ed News. So these people who have plagiarized my work are pretending solution, each of which purported propositions of solution I have disproven not only in my original work, but which I've gone to extremes to produce proofs of in my current work as they arise. So in truth, I was here long before these other people. I'm 10 years before the official internet. I'm the first online monetary reform presence in documentation of this thesis of inevitable failure and singular solution. That is, one and one only solution for the categoric faults of any possible economy in what I call mathematically perfected economy. Now, it wasn't until the economies of the world began to tumble that these other people finally stood up and said they projected these things. And examples of other people who are plagiarizing my work are Lyndon LaRouche. Lyndon LaRouche wasn't claiming the economies were going to fail in the in the 1970s as he's claiming, and I basically proved off the top of my head in 1968 that the economies of the world could only fail. He's still violating the principles by which you would do that, because he's advocating this Glass-Steagall Act, which of course I see is the first point on IFRI. Now, the thing to understand about that is, I could pose it to you in a rhetorical question. If banking has to be eradicated in order to solve not only this perpetual escalation of injustice in the obfuscation of our promissory obligations, but even to avoid terminal failure, what possible benefit can be had by preserving banking as it must be preserved for the so-called Glass-Steagall Act to even be relevant to anything? That's a question for you to ask. It's yourselves. It's a very serious question, because if you preserve banking, there is no chance of solving the issues. Banking is the problem, and Glass-Steagall merely separates banking into so-called commercial banks and so-called investment banks. Well, if this money doesn't even inherently belong to banks ever, how could you ever even have banks investing it? how could you even have investment banks? If banks merely obfuscate our promissory obligations, so that for merely publishing evidence